Hello my bookish friends out there in booktube land, welcome to another episode of Tristan and the Classics. Are you ready for a new endeavour of reading for 2022? Well, if you are, you're going to love this video because we are going to take a look at 52 classic books by 52 different authors for 52 weeks of the year. So strap on your seatbelts because we'll be whizzing through these as fast as we can. Just to say, the way this video is going to work is we are going to take at least 2 books from each decade from 1780 all the way through to 1980. Some of the decades will have extra books to add up to the 52 in total. So, are you ready? Let's start with our first one from 1780. Love and Madness by Sir Herbert Croft is a book built around the real-life murder of Martha Ray, the mistress of the 4th Earl of Sandwich. Sounds like a dark comedy, doesn't it? But it's not. This book was a sensation when it was released. People couldn't get enough of it. They thought the letters contained in the book were actually real. It contained elements of forgery as well, with 2 forgers in particular, and people went wild for it. Paul and Virginie by Jacques-Henri Bernardin is the story of 2 young people, a boy and a girl, on the island of Mauritius, better known as Ile-de-France back in the day. They are children of nature, they are childhood sweethearts, but unbelievably, can anywhere that is touched by the Western powers escape the stultifying, claustrophobic miasma that is the hierarchy of society, sophisticated society. A brutal satire, this book is, so you might enjoy it if you've never read it before. We go into the 1790s now to the preeminent Gothic authoress Anne Radcliffe. The story is a Sicilian romance. In this book we have Giulia Mazzini who wants to marry Hippolytus, her true love. However, her father, the Marquis, wants her to marry Luovo, who is a duke. Hippolytus and Giulia try to make a run for it the night before the wedding, but they are caught and Hippolytus is given a fatal blow. This story has it all for the Gothic genre: psychological terror, imposing castles, secret passages, and forgotten prisoners. One of the first novels in the American canon is written by Royal Tyler and it is called The Algerine Captive. In this book we have a native of Boston called Dr. Updike Underhill. That's a name I'd like to go into, but there's no time. He becomes the surgeon on board a slave ship, but while he is in Africa, he too is captured by some Algerians and taken away into slavery itself. Will he learn any lessons? Will we learn anything about attitudes toward race and slavery back in the day? We are now into the 1890s and it's Castle Rackrent we want to look at. This is one of the books which sets up the modern novel as we know it by Maria Edgeworth. It's told by the servant Quirk, who recounts the history of the Rackrent lords, 4 generations of them, and they each have different characters. One is the dissipate drunkard, the other one is a gambler, another one is legalistic and miserable, and the other one is good-hearted but a fool. And it all works out to the advantage of Quirk's son, Jason, who can continually grow his own position and wealth through them. Tour de force of comedy, satire, and insight into society at the turn of the 19th century. Also in the 1890s, we have A Woman of Colour, A Tale. All that's known about this is it was authored by a woman of colour and recounts the story of a Jamaican heiress who is biracial who is sent back to Britain by her father to make a good marriage. But how will she be received in society? This book will give you an insight into actual attitudes at the turn of the 19th century on race and abolition and slavery, all told through the perspective of the narrator, who is a very racially conscious narrator. Into the 1810s, and no list would be complete without Jane Austen, and this one is Mansfield Park. Fanny Price is sent to live with her rich aunt and her husband, the Bertrams. She grows up with her 4 cousins, 2 boys, 2 girls, and she is involved in watching how the different characters develop, those who are indulged, how their attitude towards marriage goes. There is a scandal in this book which is very unusual for Jane Austen because we're talking adultery. And then you've got the always suspicious characters who are charming that turn up in the Crawfords, who appeal to Fanny Price, but will her morality win out? And what happened to the Jane Austen that wrote Pride and Prejudice to make her write this? Set in the 12th century, Ivanhoe is Sir Walter Scott's masterpiece which turned the entire generation, not only of Britain but Europe, to look back to medievalism and long for the past. In this book you have castles, you have knights in armour, battles, thumping axes, wishing arrows. You have gay, vibrant, jousting tournaments, you have rogues, you have witches, you have dark and sinister plots, and if you love Robin Hood and your idea of medievalism and King Richard the Lionheart and Bad King John is something in your mind, you owe it all to this book. Ivanhoe's colours go in deep veins through all of history from that time to now, sort of tinging everything you think or imagine about medieval Europe. Bang! We are in the 1820s, and the first book we want to look at is Vivian Grey by Benjamin Disraeli. Yes, the Prime Minister of Great Britain, though he wasn't Prime Minister when he wrote this. Vivian Grey is an ambitious political climbing character. It's a buildings romance because you start with his youth and how he goes through the education system, but how the best education that rounds him off is hard experience, which is a brutal teacher. We see him try to grow through the political ranks by making alliances which don't work because others are interested in their own advancement. He tries to build his own political party. What becomes of that? The whole thing crescendos when the egocentric Vivian Grey meets with quite a calamity, but you'll have to read it to find out exactly what that is and what happens afterwards. Next on our list is a Chinese classic written in 1827. It is called The Flowers in the Mirror. This book is set in the Qing dynasty of the 6th century BC. The Empress has ousted her own son from being emperor, and the power goes to her head to the point where she demands that all flowers be in bloom by the next morning. Scared of her, the fairies make sure that the flowers are in bloom, but they offend all of the gods who then push them out of their spiritual place to reside on the earth. There is so much that goes on in this 100-chapter book, but what is so amazing about it is how it eulogises women and sets them up as people who are just as capable of ruling and of making decisions and owning businesses as men are, because everyone who is in a position of power in this book is a woman. The entire cabinet of government for the Empress are women. All of her servants are women. The people who own business are women. And the men, they wear women's clothes, stay at home and raise the children. How interesting is that? A third book from the 1820s, which is 1827, is the Italian classic, The Betrothed, by Alessandro Manzoni. This book is probably more influential than any other Italian book, and that's saying something because it's up against Dante and his Divine Comedy. In the book, you find Renzo and Lucia. They are slated to be wed when the night before he is accosted by two thugs who say, "Do not marry Lucia." When he goes to the church the next day, it's been called off anyway. He finds out that it's down to some nefarious Don Rodrigo. Yes, it's a Spanish name because this is set in the 17th century Italy, which was under the dominion of Spain at the time. One of the greatest things about this book, for anyone who has read it, is the brilliant, most vivid capturing of the panic and the depiction of the plague in Milan. If you read this, it will never ever leave you. We slide into the 1830s now, and novels are taking a bit of a change. The one we want to look at is from that great writer, Victor Hugo, and it is Hunchback of Notre Dame. When he started writing this book, his purpose was to make an appeal to save Gothic architecture. This is why the book is heavy on description of buildings, notably Notre Dame, the centrepiece itself, the great cathedral by the Seine. People of the time were pulling everything down after the revolution. Now, Hugo is saying, keep these beautiful medieval buildings. However, on top of that, he has Esmeralda at the centre of the plot with four men infatuated with her. They are Phoebus, Frollo, Gringoire and Quasimodo. What we find in this book is how people go about living according to their character. We see a fear of outsiders, both the majority fearing a minority and the minority fearing anyone from the majority. There is a lot of intrigue, backstabbing and just foul play in this book set against someone else who has a very, very good heart. If you haven't read this book, you really should in 2022. Next is another French classic by Balzac, and it is Eugenie Grandet. Monsieur Grandet has amassed a great fortune and a great amount of land after the aristocracy was stripped of it following the Terror and the rise of the Republic under Napoleon. But frugality becomes a vice for Monsieur Grandet, who is so mean and miserly. He only gives a little bit of pocket money to his wife and then to his daughter. He counts the slices of bread he has before breakfast. He barely pays for anything. When the village suddenly realise he's 60 years old, and when he dies, that vast fortune will go to his only daughter, Eugenie. So who will get to marry her? Into the 1840s, and we step over to Russia, and we're talking about Nikolai Gogol's Dead Souls. In this story, Pavel Chichikov goes around Russia buying up dead souls, that is, peasants or serfs who have died but are still on the books to be taxed. He buys their name rights from the estates of those who are masters over them, and they're happy to get rid of these names so they don't have to pay tax. Why is he doing it? Will he be rumbled? The reason is he wants to take out loans in the names of these dead serfs and buy himself a great estate in eastern Russia. One of the focuses of this book is on the spiritual emptiness of the world of Gogol's day. Agnes Grey by Anne Bronte is the first book that Anne Bronte wrote. It tells the story of Agnes Grey and how she sets off to help her family who have fallen into hard times by becoming a governess for richer families. She has a great idea of how to teach the children, but realises most of the troubles actually come from the parents who do not want their children to be disciplined, but do want them to grow up correctly. She meets a whole array of characters, but she only goes to 2 families where we see the problems of different types of parenting and not allowing someone to educate their children properly. But she also finds love, or at least a love interest, and she finds genuine comfort and solace from older ones in her community and by doing good. William Makepeace Thackeray didn't just possess the best middle name in all of history, but also wrote one of the best books, and that is Vanity Fair, an 800 to 900 page romp through high society in Great Britain at the time of Napoleon, and Waterloo itself features in this book. In it you have Becky Sharp and Amelia Sedley, who come out of Mrs Pinkerton's finishing school for girls and enter high society. Becky Sharp is a wily, seductive vixen who is cut out for the hypocritical and seedy but elegant climbing through the social ladder, whereas Amelia Sharp is much quieter. You're also introduced to a great host of people, notably the raffish officer George Osborne and the lovely William Dobbins. We are now at the middle of the 19th century, the 1850s, and we have got, starting with that famous line, "Call me Ishmael," the famous work by Herman Melville, Moby Dick. And no, it's not a story about a detective DJ, it's about the white whale that is the obsession of Captain Ahab of the Pequod, who wants to hunt it down because it's cost him injuries in his own life when the whale has sunk other ships at sea, based on a real event with the ship Essex, which was sunk by a whale. This book has got a lot of things in it. For instance, Starbucks, the coffee chain, gets its name from this book, but there's just no time for me to stop and talk about it. We also have Queequeg, the wonderful harpooner, and of course we have Ishmael himself. Some of the most brilliant prose, most beautiful prose is in this book, but there are also some very, very stodgy chapters all about whales and their biology and morphology. However, it is a great book of obsession, isolation, revenge, being part of nature, feeling small, knowing our own mortality. Our next book was the most popular, the most sold and most distributed book of the 19th century, and it is Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin. Uncle Tom is that long-suffering slave who forms the pivot on which all the other characters' lives and accounts rotate through the book. Beecher Stowe shows slavery in all its gritty ugliness, its brutish, beastly setup, and how it needs to be ended, and that the way to end it is through Christian love, because of course she was part of the evangelical movement who wanted to love all people. 1 million copies of this book sold in Britain alone, where the national pride was getting rid of slavery the world over, and it gave a needed impetus to keep the abolitionist movement going and made a huge effect on ending slavery in the United States of America. Into the 1860s, and we have a great book by Wilkie Collins. It is The Moonstone. The Moonstone was stolen during the siege of Seringapatam by a British officer who then takes it back to Britain, but there are guardians of the Moonstone who want to get it back. Shunned by his family, this officer leaves the Moonstone in his will to his niece Rachel. One night she wears it, I think it's to her birthday party, and that night it's stolen. Suspicion falls on 3 Indian jugglers who have come into the neighbourhood, a maidservant who has begun to act quite odd, and Rachel herself. And by the time everyone leaves, the Moonstone has not been found, but that is not the end of the story, it's only just beginning. Our Mutual Friend by Charles Dickens is next. It's one of his most sophisticated works, and it's a real intriguer and head-scratcher. A miser has a huge fortune and then dies. The only 2 people who are really close to him were Mr and Mrs Boffin, a naive and good-natured couple, but the whole fortune is given in the will to his estranged son Hexam, who is abroad and is told if he wants the fortune he must come back home and marry a woman he's never met. Of course, what could be more natural? Unfortunately, Hexam does not appear until one day his body is fished out of the River Thames. Who did it? By the way, if you love classic literature and want to get into the classic literature and extract more from it, then hit the subscribe button and dingling the bell. Join me as I do in-depth reviews of classic books, talk about certain time periods, certain genres and styles and what makes them, comic synopses of certain books, and read-alongs and book hauls. Anyway, let's get into the 1870s. In 1871, Émile Zola wrote the book The Fortunes of the Rougons, which is probably being butchered by me because I don't speak French. This book being the first one, it starts in pre-revolution Provence, where you have the eccentric main character at the time of Adelaide Fouquet, I believe is how you pronounce it. She has a short marriage with a labourer called Rougon and has a child with him. But later, when he's dead, she has an affair with a smuggler and a poacher and has 2 illegitimate children called the Macquarts. Her original son, the original Rougon, wants to disinherit the 2 illegitimate children, the Macquarts. Next we have a lesser read book of Thomas Hardy's, A Pair of Blue Eyes, in which we have the love triangle of Alfred Swancourt, there's an Anglo-Saxon name if you ever needed one, Stephen Smith, the ambitious but lower-born mason, and then I think it's Henry Knight, who is an older gentleman who represents established London society. Who is going to win Alfred's hand? How is she going to respond to their different positions in society? And how do her parents impinge on everything? Still in the 1870s, we come to the magnificent, the amazing, the incomparable George Eliot and her masterpiece, Daniel Deronda. Daniel Deronda meets Gwendolen Harleth in a German town. She's attractive. He's drawn to her but very, very wary because he sees her waste her money in one game of roulette. Later, a letter from Gwendolen's mother arrives saying that she needs to return home because the family have become financially ruined. She goes and pawns a very expensive necklace of hers and is thinking about gambling the winnings there to make her fortune to help her family when a porter brings her necklace back to her. Daniel had watched her pawn it and had bought it back for her. This changes her attitude, and now we are thrust into 2 strains of the story. One side Gwendolen's story, one side Daniel Deronda's story. Into the 1880s, and we have the book Niels Lyhne by Jens Peter Jacobsson of Sweden. Niels Lyhne, the titular character, goes through a dramatic change when he suffers various bereavements and problems and the renunciation of his faith and ultimately complete and utter disillusionment with life. This book explores the inner turmoil and struggle of a person in a bewildering world. It's not just a critique of faith though, he also criticises atheism. So, one for you to chew on. The next book is the great novella The Death of Ivan Illyich by Leo Tolstoy. One day, he's hanging up his curtains when he takes a tumble and hurts himself. This injury actually leads to him ultimately dying. The clue's in the title. when he comes towards his death, he's confronted with what is an authentic life, what is a good life. He thinks he's led a good life and doesn't deserve to suffer. But when he meets the sympathetic and compassionate Gerasim, a young peasant boy, it makes him begin to question what life is truly about. Believe me when I tell you this book will blow your mind. We hike our way across the Atlantic now to Brazil, where we have the wonderful posthumous memoirs of Brás Cubas, otherwise known as Epitaph of a Small Winner, written by Machado de Assis. Brás Cubas writes the book when he's dead. He has died and is looking back on his life and remembering little snippets here and there, and overall weighing up whether he led a good life or a bad life, whether it was successful or not. And he believes he came out a very small winner. But why does he think he's a winner? This is a brilliant book which will make you laugh. We're in the 1890s now, almost at the end of the century, and we're looking at the Nobel Prize winning Quo Vadis, whither dost thou go, it means in English, written by Emmerich Sienkiewicz. In this book, Marcus Vinicius, a young Roman, meets a girl called Ligeia from a barbarian people. He doesn't know, but she's a Christian. He wants to marry her, so asks his uncle to use his influence with Emperor Nero to get Ligeia. But before sending her, Nero wants to meet her himself, and she is brought to one of his parties, where as a Christian, she is appalled by the decadence of the Roman morals. En route to Vinicius's house, she is saved by fellow Christians and disappears. But Marcus Vinicius's uncle, tries to find her again. What happens next is an enduring tale of uprightness and morality in the face of opposition and danger, and also the persecution of the Christians, which you could take as a lesson in a minority against the massive might of an imperial state. In 1899, we come to our last book of the 19th century by Selma Lagerlöf, and it is A Manorhouse Tale, or The Tale of a Manor House. What does one do when all of one's goats die in a blizzard? Well, Gunnar and Ingrid have a similar but opposite reaction. One of them falls into a death-like trance, and the other one goes stark raving mad. How will they cope with the psychological darknesses and labyrinthine tortuous circuits of the human mind, and can they ever recover? Does love actually help heal a person who is struggling betwixt sanity and complete mental breakdown? That's what you'll get to explore in this Swedish classic. Welcome to the 20th century. We are in 1901 and we're looking at Thomas Mann's Buddenbrooks, that epic that he wrote at 26 years of age. The Xbox and PlayStation have a lot to answer for. In this story, we follow a group of generations, I think it's 3 or 4 generations of the Buddenbrooks, who are originally a corn merchant, a grain merchant family from the Hanseatic League, so they're the higher bourgeois society. What we follow is the different lives of an absolutely enormous cast, but each with their own personality traits, each with their own interests. Some travel, some do other things. One of them ends up in Chile. But how the advance of time and the changing of modernist values have an effect on the old bourgeois setup. How do you summarise a book that is fatter than a whale omelette? I don't know, but there you are. Next up, we have After the Divorce by the remarkable Italian authoress Grazia Deledda. In this book, you have Constantine and Giovanna, who are married, but then Constantine's wicked uncle is murdered. Suspicion, and eventually accusation, falls upon Constantine himself. Even though he is innocent, he accepts the fate for the sake of his wife Giovanna. Once he's in prison, Giovanna cannot support herself and so divorces him and marries somebody else. But the real killer comes forward and Constantine is released. Now what takes place? Next we have O Pioneers by Willa Cather. This is her second book, set out in the town of Hanover, Nebraska, the prairies. The Bergson families are an immigrant family who have a farm out there in Nebraska. Alexandra Bergson, she inherits the farm after her father's death, and she decides that she's going to make it a working enterprise when many other immigrant workers are leaving the prairies. This book also follows two romantic relationships, and one of the things about Cather's writings is that it's one of the most evocative capturing of the Midwest prairies. Still out there in the middle of America, we come to Sherwood Anderson's book, Winesburg, Ohio. This is a short story cycle. We have 22 stories told by, I think it's George Willard, from his early days as a child in this backwater little town to the days when he actually abandons the town, leaves to go somewhere else. Each story will focus on the life and character of one of the town's occupants as they go to deal with their own loneliness and isolation and the humdrum mundanity that is life in this quaint little place, Winesburg. We're into the 1920s now, and we're looking at the dystopian classic Russian novel We by Yevgeny Zamyatin. This is probably the forerunner to all the great dystopian novels. In fact, George Orwell said that Aldous Huxley's Brave New World was derived from this book, and then Aldous Huxley said, "How very dare you." In the book We have a one-state world. It's conquered the whole place, and it's totalitarian. Everybody lives in glass houses so that the secret police can keep an eye on them. We follow a chief engineer who's working on a spaceship which is going to go out to explore and conquer extraterrestrial planets, and he starts keeping a diary or a journal. Now his name is D503. His girlfriend is called O90. One day, while he's out on a walk with O90, he meets L330. This is a woman who is unlike many others he's met. She takes him to a place which is not glass and has artifacts from the past, and they're beautiful and aesthetically pleasing. He wants to denounce her, but he can't. And then we see the progression of the story through this totalitarian state and its endeavours to hold on to power at all costs, turning humans into tractors, as it were, by making them mechanically reliable through something called the Great Operation. So, if you like dystopian novels, why not try that one out? The next book we're looking at is All Quiet on the Western Front by Erich Maria Remarque. He did himself go into the trenches at World War I. In this book, Remarque himself explains it best when he says that he wrote this book neither as a criticism, nor as a confession, nor as an adventure, because death is not an adventure, he says quite starkly. He says that this book is written about the ordinary men who fought in the war, whom, although they survived it, shells were destroyed by it overall, even when they returned home. Our next book, also in the 1920s, is from Sinclair Lewis, the Nobel Prize winner, and this is his most famous work, Main Street. The book is set in Gopher Prairie, Minnesota, and is a real satire of small-town life and small-town mentalities. It discusses the conflict between Carol Milford Kennicott coming up against the small-time attitudes compared to her more broad-minded nature. It takes us from pre-war through to America's entry into the war, and then just after the war when Prohibition has started. Scottish writer A.G. MacDonald writes our next book, and it is England, Their England. In it, the protagonist, Donald Cameron, is a young Scottish guy who keeps a journal. He got injured in First World War and was invalided back home, and now he's worked for various newspapers as a journalist when a Welshman asks him if he could write a travel guide to the English for foreigners to understand. And so he embarks on a smorgasbord of snippets of English life as he visits a high society party, as he works as the secretary to a government official, as he goes to the League of Nations, and where he goes into and explains and participates in the enduringly funny village cricket match. If you like Evelyn Waugh, if you love P.G. Wodehouse, then you will like the way MacDonald writes this book, because it's that typical English buffoonery. Have you read The Big Sleep by Raymond Chandler? This is the hard-boiled detective genre which introduces us to Philip Marlowe for the first time. Originally classed as part of Pulp Fiction, Le Monde, the French newspaper, classed this as one of the 100 most critical books of the 20th century. Philip Marlowe is hired by General Sternwood, who believes that his young daughter Carmen is being blackmailed by a bookseller called Geiger. Marlowe sets out to investigate. He sees the clerk at the bookseller's store and soon works out that this shop is a front for selling pornography and other lewd images. He then follows Geiger back to his home where he stakes it out. He sees young Carmen go in to visit him. Then there's a gunshot and a scream and 2 cars race away. Marlowe runs in to find Geiger dead on the floor and Carmen unconscious and in the buff. He then takes Carmen back home, but when he returns, Geiger's body has gone. What does all this add up to? Well, that's what The Big Sleep is all about. Our next book is The Heart is a Lonely Hunter by Carson McCullers. She was only 23 years old when she wrote this book. We have John Singer and Spiros Antonopoulos. They're both deaf-mute men in a small town in America. When Spiros becomes mentally ill and starts misbehaving, despite his best efforts, John, his friend, can't keep him out of the mental asylum, and so John moves to another apartment. What follows is the full story, which has 4 different characters. A tomboy, a drunk, a physician and a store owner who all unburden themselves of their secrets to the deaf-mute John Singer himself. This is a very intriguing plot. I have never read this book, haven't even heard of the author, and yet I found out that it was a highly significant book of the 1940s. Our next book comes from the other side of the world, which is Australia, unless you live in Australia, in which case I'm the other side of the world. This is the book The Living and the Dead by Patrick White. It starts off at the beginning of just before the Second World War, and we have the Standish family that live disparate, disjointed lives under one roof. We have the mother, Catherine, her son, Elliot, and the daughter, Eden, all going about life in their own way, seeking to make their own mark in the world, their own inner thoughts, but they are very disconnected with one another. And of course, the whole smallness of their existence is brought into stark relief by the impending war that looms very close over the horizon. Our next book is by Simone de Beauvoir, and it is All Men Are Mortal. In this book, we have the attractive and egocentric actress Regine, and she meets the curious Raymond Fosca, and he tells her something unique about him. He is immortal. She doesn't quite understand this. All she can think of, from her own perspective, is, how can I be immortal myself? He moves away from her, but she seeks him out, and then he begins to tell his story, which starts, I was born in the 13th century in the town of Carmona, where there are warring factions trying to control the city. What happens from here, I do not know, but isn't that a great, great premise for a book? Our final book from the 1940s is that classic of George Orwell's Animal Farm. Animal Farm is an allegory of the Soviet Union and its rise, looking at characters like Stalin and Trotsky by looking at Manor Farm, where the animals drive out the humans and hope to set up a commune which is where all animals are equal. But the pigs are more intelligent. And what we see is how someone will always rise to the top to dominate others. We're into the 1950s now, and we want to take a look at a book by Rumer Godden. Better known for Black Narcissus, we want to look at a lesser known book, Kingfishers Catch Fire, in which a recently widowed young English woman who is left with 2 children and very little means to sustain herself and her kids decides that she will stay in India rather than return to Britain. While she's there, she becomes idealistically enamoured with the idea of living the Indian peasant life, and so sets about doing so, only to have frequent misunderstandings and casually funny encounters with the people of India. This is a rich comedic exploration of an idealistic way of living. Our next book is A Train to Pakistan by Khushwant Singh. This is about the partition of India and Pakistan in 1947 from the perspective of a border town village called Manorhouse. What this does is it gives us a real human insight into the effects of the partition rather than just a geopolitical cold university textbook. The real feelings of people as they experience the dividing of a nation, the believability, the colour, the terror, the upset that it can cause is all brought out in vivid life in this classic work. Ayn Rand's behemoth magnum opus Atlas Shrugged is next. In this book, which is a libertarian science fiction, we have a dystopian United States of the future. In this, private businesses and business owners are constantly hampered by more and more laws and regulations and coercion. The two main characters in it who are in love find themselves at the mercy of looters who just want to take advantage of their productivity. Eventually, they meet a fellow called Galt. John Galt, I think his name is. And he is going around advocating to business owners that they should all disappear and live off-grid and let America face the consequences of having no productive workers. What's going to happen to society? How will the looters and those who don't make businesses respond? Billy Pilgrim is the central figure in Kurt Vonnegut's classic Slaughterhouse 5. We follow Billy from his early days up to becoming a soldier, then his enrolment in Second World War as a chaplain's assistant, and into the post-war years. Billy Pilgrim actually travels back and forth in time a few times in this book, but it mainly focuses on his capture by the German army, the bombing of Dresden, and the experiences as a prisoner of war. What's been said about this book is that no other novel has achieved such moral clarity as this one. Now you'll have to read it to see why. Mr Biswas is born in the wrong way, and a pundit prophesies that he will cause damage to his mother and father and that he should be kept away from trees and water, especially water. How interesting is that? This is the main character from V.S. Naipaul's great book, A House for Mr Biswas. And he's a Hindu who is born in Trinidad and Tobago, and it's his story of trying to get ahead in life, make a success in life, and how it keeps going wrong and backfiring. We have the early days where he does indeed get into a bit of trouble when he first comes across water, and that affects his father in particular. He also wants to romance somebody and inadvertently gets involved in marrying them. How does this all work out? Can he ever get things correct? Our final classic from the 1960s is Snow Country by Yasumaru Kawabata, if I'm saying that correctly. In this book, you have the protagonist who is a young, rich dilettante, you would say. Shimamura is his name. And he is heading north to a village called Onsen, I believe it is. And he's on a train where he sees a beautiful woman looking after a sickly man. And he watches her through the reflection in the train window. And this is significant for the themes of traditional beauty and modernity, the changing of Japanese culture. When he goes to the town, he's actually there to meet a girl who wasn't a geisha when he first met her, but now she is, and her name's Kamoko. They start talking to each other, but of course a love affair is forbidden in this instance, and you see the difficulties in their relationship, but also opening up to one another, and you start to learn how the girl on the train is linked to Kamoko as well. And how does all of this work out? I certainly want to read more Japanese classics, so this one is going to be something I try to get through this year. Into the 1970s, and we're at Iris Murdoch's novel The Sea, the Sea. Charles Araby decides to withdraw from the world, from modern life, and go and live a recluse by the sea and write his memoirs when he bumped into Mary Fitch. This was his sweetheart love when he was an adolescent. Now, although she's almost unrecognisable because they're both old, he begins to idealise the past and a romance that could have been, and actually tries to get her to elope with him. What this book discusses is the jealousy and the selfishness and the lack of compassion that often lays beneath the facade we present to the outer world. I don't know much more about this book, but this is probably Iris Murdoch's most famous one in all of the many, many books she wrote, this being number 19. Also in the 70s, we have the renowned work by Italo Calvino, Invisible Cities. This is set up as a discussion, a dialogue between the famous Emperor Kublai Khan and the explorer Marco Polo. They're having a discussion. All the time, different merchants are coming and going and talking to the emperor about his empire, but Kublai Khan is interested in talking to Marco Polo about the cities he has seen, and we have almost 55 poems, as it were, about different cities. These are all not allegorical, but insights into culture and death and language and memory and desire, all parts of human structure and society. And at one point, Kublai Khan says, "There's one city you will not tell me about," obviously Marco Polo's home city, and Marco Polo says, "Every city I tell you about also reveals something about Venice." We're into the 1980s now and just 2 books to go. This one is In the Name of the Rose by Umberto Eco. The year is 1327. Sir William Baskerville is sent over to Italy on a very delicate mission, but it's all overshadowed when a string of murders take place over 7 days at a monastery or an abbey. Baskerville now wants to work out what's causing the murders, or who is causing the murders, and goes into the dark, belly, labyrinthine world of the monastic orders. Month in the Country by J. Al Carr, a short novella and one I've talked about many times on this channel. It is beautiful, a masterpiece in symmetric writing. Birkin turns up in a quaint village after World War I to restore a mural that's been whitewashed over in a little church. While he's there, he notices a man working as an archaeologist in a field next to the church by the name of Moon. They both understand each other from coming from the war. They both have sort of shyish personality characters, while Moon's a bit more outgoing. But as Birkin peels back the layers to reveal the picture, the medieval fresco, he begins to get wrapped up in the nature of the painter who painted it. Meanwhile, Moon, who is digging and looking for a deceased member of the village and its history, we find something in common between them as well. All of this is set with just the mild and lovely interaction of a quaint rural village, a capturing of the essence of one moment of a month in the rural countryside of Britain after World War I. This is a beautiful piece of work. So we've now arrived at the last book on our list of 52 books by 52 authors in 52 weeks of reading, if you so wish to undertake that kind of challenge. This book does not come from between the years 1780 to 1980. It comes from before that, because no list would be complete without one from the bard himself, William Shakespeare. I could have picked a lot of different Shakespeares, and maybe you could pick one of your own choice, but I do recommend that you do read a Shakespeare, even if you find him hard. The one I've gone for is Richard III. It's not his best play, but it's one of his best characters. The most openly wicked, devious, scheming Machiavellian. In fact, he says he's so bad he can take Machiavel to school. This book is one that I've picked because it has got some great soliloquies in it, some brilliant turns of phrase, but I have done a number of videos on Richard III on this channel in my list on Shakespeare Explained. So if you want to get into Shakespeare this year, maybe read Richard III and use some of my videos where I go line by line through some of the scenes so that you can understand what's going on and appreciate the majesty that is William Shakespeare. Well, I hope you've enjoyed this video. 52 authors, 52 books for 52 weeks of the year. Are you maybe setting that as a task to do this year, to read one book a week? If not, why don't you pick some of the books that take your fancy? What I would really like you to do, if you appreciate all the effort that went into researching this, is comment below and but comment, tell me which ones do you like the sound of? Which ones have you read? Which ones did you love? And please, if you wouldn't mind, recommend this, share this on your Instagram or share it on your Facebook and let others come and check out these classics so that we can get a bigger discussion and a bigger interest in really good literature. Until the next time, I wish you joy in your reading.